Mendagio, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you William Tillier, who I affectionately know as Tillier. And so when I say Bill today, he may not know to whom I'm referring. Well, Bill is a psychologist, and I guess among all the other achievements, the reason that I'm here to introduce him is because of his invaluable contribution to the theory of positive disintegration. Now, Bill is when he talks about how he was introduced to the theory, his response is that it saved his life. And he was first introduced to the theory by Marlene at the University. I know, he'll correct me if I'm wrong. Marlene at the University of Alberta while he was working on his master's. And he eventually became Dabrowski's last graduate student and protege. And what Bill has done, see, I met Bill about, it was 1990. So I know some of this firsthand. What Bill has done is that he has really lived up to his promise. I'm not going to say the name properly. Kazimierz Dabrowski. Pardon me, Christina?
Kazimierz.
Kazimierz. KD. He lived up his promise to KD that he would not let the theory die. And the fact that we're here today is a good attestation to that promise. But I think the best experience Bill has had is his collaboration with me. So without further ado, William Tillier.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do my presentation today at all, because I do not believe that it is large enough for this screen. I think the screen, that my presentation should be bigger. I'm going to suggest something to you folks. Thank you very much for that introduction. I probably wouldn't be here today without you, so thank you very much. And I wouldn't be here today without a lot of help, and I very much appreciate the help I'm receiving from three outstanding people I have to acknowledge, and that's Gemma Cruz, and Andrew Maskrin, and Renee Castanos. And I wouldn't be here today physically if I didn't have their help today. So thank you very much. You know, thinking about this conference and preparing this presentation has been an up and down experience for me. It's exactly 20 years ago, almost to the day, that a group of the original students from Edmonton went to Keystone, Colorado, and called for course correction. At that time, the theory had been mostly looked at in the United States and mostly in the gifted field. And there were some disparities. We went down to Colorado and Keystone. It was 1994 in the summer, and we called for a course correction. And I am going to challenge each and every one of you today. I believe that we need a course correction again. And throughout the presentation, as you see it unfold, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's been a long way, but it's been a wonderful trip. And I appreciate you coming to the talk. Thank you very much. So, next please. Now, I have something very important to say to you guys. Okay, are you going to do it?
Yeah.
Okay. We are experts, and we will tell you everything you need to know about Dabrowski. Okay? Oh my God. Are you sure? You can't be serious. We're not experts. We don't know everything. They're not going to learn anything from us. Okay. We don't subscribe to the authoritarian model of academia. We subscribe to the archaeological model. If you want answers, you have to break through the surface, and you have to dig. You have to dig through the strata until you find the answers you're looking for. You're not going to learn anything about Dabrowski here that you can't find in the books and in the material. So I think it's very important to understand that. I'm going to use an analogy here. I'm giving you a pair of binoculars, and I'm saying, here, let's go look at the moon. I'm not making you into astronomers. If you want to be an astronomer, go for it. I'm just whetting your appetite. So please do not be mistaken. If you want to learn Dabrowski, it's there in front of you. Next, please. Now, these are your presenters. You know, it occurs to me that perhaps you should have seen this beforehand. Right? I only have one thing to say about Sal Mendagio.
This is not about me, it's about the theory.
That's true. You know what? It's not about me. It's not about Sal. Dabrowski would say, if he was standing here today, Dabrowski would say, listen, it's not about me. It's about the theory. And that's true. But I want to say something to you, Sal. If you had been my father, I would have had a better life, and I would have been it would have been easier for me. I mean it, my friend. Now, I've put Dexter up here. I hope this is not irrelevant. It might be irrelevant, but I hope it's not irrelevant. Because Dexter has a Buddhist background, and so that's why I put that there. Thank you for supplying your picture, Susan.
It's not a photograph.
Well, I thought it was a pretty good likeness. Next, please. Now, the way I've designed this presentation, this talk, as you can see, I've been criticized in the past as being too academic and too... People have suggested it was like going to church, hearing me speak, Roman Catholic Church, that is, too. Because I was too serious, so I've tried to lighten the mood a little bit. But this is deadly serious stuff to me. I take a lot of responsibility. I feel a lot of responsibility coming here and talking to you. And this presentation is only the introduction. This presentation is on the website, so you don't have to write anything down off the presentation. Dabrowski 201 is a more sophisticated, longer presentation. It involves 450 slides. And I've just revised it in the spring. And I think it's a good introduction to Dabrowski. I'm saying that carefully. It's an introduction to him. So if you're interested in this, then go to him. And that's 301, which is all of his original materials that I can obtain and get out on the internet. And so that's the sequence. Next, please. Okay. you may be in for some surprises, because I keep hearing over and over, people say, gee, that's not what I thought it was. Or, gee, I didn't know that was part of it. And so again, hold on. Next, please. Now, one thing that I've run into is the theory of particle disintegration. I understood it. I related to it the minute I read it. Okay? It struck me. It helped me. It gave me a context. I was 23 at the time. It gave me a context for my background, for my history, for my childhood. And it was important from that perspective. I can honestly say to you, I think it took me, I would say 20, maybe 25 years before I appreciated it, and before I fully really felt that I understood the depth of it. And I think that's important to emphasize. Come on in. Don't be scared, I'm not. Now, that being said, if Dabrowski does not hook you, then that's fine. Saint-Exupéry was one of Dabrowski's favorite authors, and he referred to The Little Prince. And Exupéry writes the book in a way that presents a story. And at the end of the story, he basically says, okay, now look, if this is you, if you look up there and see this, then that's wonderful. If you don't, that's okay too. Okay? So it's not for everyone. Next, please. Leo Moss was one of Dabrowski's, he was Dabrowski's first student in Edmonton, and the longest person. Leo was the administrative assistant at the Theoretical Center for Psychology in Edmonton. And if I can just divert a little bit, Dabrowski was recruited by Tom Nelson, who was in psychology. But Tom didn't know what to do with it. So I don't think Dabrowski ever taught a lecture in psychology. He was shuffled over to theoretical psychology, which was a perfect fit, because the previous director there had been Ludwig von Bertalanffy. And Bertalanffy had written a book on psychology. He was a theoretical biologist, but he wrote a book on psychology, and he called psychology rapamorphic, because they studied rats. And he formulated the opinion that the average person was a robot, and he called them robopaths. Okay, and this kind of created an atmosphere that when Dabrowski got there, Joe Royce was there. Royce was an expert in factor analysis, and was applying factor analysis to personality. And so this was the home of personality, trying to figure it out, and this was a good atmosphere for Dabrowski. And Leo was the administrative assistant at that time. And so Royce told Leo, figure out what to do with this guy. And Leo, thank God he did this. Leo sat down with Dabrowski and 4 or 5 grad students and said, what are you about? What's your theory about? I've read your 1964 book. What is this? What is that? And he recorded all of those sessions on video. And those sessions are 6 hours altogether, and they're on the DVD. And you hear Leo asking all his questions. And there you have it. So that was a good introduction. That was a bit of a aside there, but here's the point I want to make here. Leo used to say, you can't understand Dabrowski unless you really feel it in your gut and you live it. And I just read Bergson, very interesting. If you like Dabrowski, you would like Bergson. And Bergson says the same thing. You can't understand this stuff by reading my book. You have to understand it by examining yourself. Okay? And one of the problems that Leo talked about, and I think he's right on the money, is that he would run into students that would try to examine Dabrowski academically, and they just didn't get it. And that's a problem, because, well, I'll elaborate that in a minute. Thanks.
Technology glitch here for you.
That's okay. Homer probably wants to dominate the screen there. By the way, I'm violating copyright. Now, this is a bit technical, but I understand that many of you are students. This is right up your alley. Dabrowski wrote a theory. That theory is composed of many, many components. Those components form a network. Cronbach and Meehl, M-E-E-H-L, wrote an article in 1955 on constructs. And part of that article said that if you want to make a theory, your constructs have to fit together. And the constructs fit together in what they call a nomenological network. And this is something that needs to be emphasized. So, wait a minute. Overexcitability is not on the screen. What's the matter? Let's start at the bottom. Developmental potential contributes to psychoneurosis, which contributes to positive disintegration. Through the process of hierarchization leads to multilevelness, which then leads to the institution of the inner psychic milieu, which then leads to the third factor, which then contributes to the hierarchy of values, which then leads to the personality ideal. Okay? Now, you cannot understand how a watch operates by studying one gear. You just can't. So you can't just pull out one construct and try to understand how the thing operates. And this is part of the problem with what's happened in the last 30 years, is that the focus has been on one construct and out of context. Okay? And again, I say, you don't get the whole picture. This, I've said, for example, I could have had another example. Dabrowski's hierarchy dynamisms. The man has 20 dynamisms that fit together in a hierarchy. So there's a whole other nomenological network. Instincts. He's got a hierarchy of instincts. There's another. So these nomenological networks all fit together. This can be frustrating because as you learn Dabrowski, you learn each one individually. But if you hang in there and if you are patient, you achieve an overview. That's what took me 20 years, I think. But the overview gives you a very, very satisfying understanding of personality development. Okay? Renee, I need my haircut. Okay. This is Renee Castanos. He's my left-hand man today. Thank you. Now, second. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Next. Being ill has some compromise. You have to make some compromises. Okay, come on now. Don't let me stall here. Do you need to point it at the machine? Now,
There it went.
I'm using a very casual approach here. As you see, I don't have this memorized. If you want to ask me a question, you're not going to throw me off, okay? So just, if you have a question, shout out. As well, I would emphasize, if I can't answer it, and I probably won't be able to, then Dexter or Susan or Sal will be able to answer it, or will come up with an answer. Or will direct you to where to find it. You cannot measure multi-level concepts with uni-level measures. Okay, it's as simple as that. Dabrowski described, and I'm not going to talk so much about levels here, like level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about uni-level and multi-level, okay? Dabrowski described concepts, and he differentiated concepts on the basis of uni-level and multi-level. So for example, love is a different concept at a low level, at a uni level, than it is at a high level, at a multi-level. And Dabrowski used to say that, he used to say that there was more of a difference between uni-level love and multi-level love than there was between love and hate. Okay? You cannot capture those differences with an instrument that's uni-level. Sal, item number 26, please.
I have strong feelings of joy, anger, excitement, and despair.
Joy.
Not personal.
Okay, that's the question. Joy. Are you talking about joy at level 1, at uni level, or are you talking about joy at level 4, multi-level? See, that question is meaningless. It's meaningless by design because it doesn't capture the difference between uni-level and multi-level. The questionnaires that have been used so far, and I'm talking about the last 30 years unfortunately, have collapsed and reduced these, the richness of these measures down to a meaningless, flat, homogeneous, without a concept. Okay, that makes it very hard. Dabrowski used a new approach, but if you look at Dabrowski's roots and where it came from, there's nothing controversial about Dabrowski. Nothing. Plato, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Pierre Janet, Sherrington, Hublings Jackson. Not one of those names evokes controversy. That's the basis of Dabrowski. So this is not a guy who's out there in left field. This is a guy who's got a very, very solid basis of psychology, of psychiatry, of neurology, of philosophy. Okay? The real introduction is not Bill or Sal or anybody. The real introduction is reading it. Now, that can be a little frustrating because, again, there's a lot there, and it takes patience, but that's where it's at. Thank you. Next. Okay, where does it fit into the schema of personality theories? Well, that's kind of where it fits. It kind of is an enlargement of Rogerian approach or a humanistic approach. It's an enlargement of Maslow. Ma'am, you don't have to take pictures because it's on the internet. But that's okay, you can if you want, you can. That's fine. It's an extension of that, okay? So that's kind of where it fits. Next, please. Many approaches describe personality, okay? I mean, there probably are, 20 major theories that describe personality. Not as many theories describe the development of personality. So, for example, Erik Erikson describes the development of personality and character. Jane Lovinger just has a theory of personality development. But not very many theories do. No theory describes the way Dabrowski does. None. And the elements can be summarized in one sentence. The fact that you, crisis and psychological distress lead to dis-ease. Geez, I'm not comfortable, I'm uneasy. That breaks the homeostasis and creates a motivation to do something about it. If there's no itch, there's no scratch. Okay? And Dabrowski contrasts multi-level and uni-level. Now, I believe that's straight out of Plato. Okay? And I've given a presentation on Plato, which I explain all that, why I think that. And talking about the prisoners in the cave, we'll elaborate that a little bit more in a minute. And compared to the prisoner who escapes and goes into the sunlight, I think that there's a good analogy there. But he's the only personality theorist that has applied that to psychology in a meaningful, constructive way. Also, the description of developmental potential. And we'll get into trouble there because we're going to have some controversy. And finally, the emphasis on developing your own unique personality. Next, please. Okay. Now, just one slide on philosophy here. Dabrowski talks about two types of philosophy that are not usually connected together. They're usually seen as an antithesis to each other. One is essence, okay? That is to say, I have an essence about me that describes me. That essence is different than Sal's or Dexter's or anybody else's. Okay? Now, Dabrowski talked about two types of essence. He talked about the essence of being a human being, or more specifically, he talked about the essence of being an authentic human being. And he talked about the essence of being an individual. And in the final analysis, Dabrowski says essence is more important. But he also talked about existentialism. That basically is, you have to make choices every day about what you emphasize, what you enlarge, and what you inhibit, and what you want to transform. And this is really the difference between Dabrowski and most theorists. Like, for example, Maslow. People don't understand this because they've never read Maslow. Maslow was very, very clear. In self-actualization, you must actualize everything that's there. Maslow talked about a self-actualized person being able to enjoy their appetites, eating without feeling guilty. having sex without feeling guilty. Maslow said that everything was on a continuum. And he literally said, there's no difference between the lowest and the highest. It's all the same thing. Dabrowski said that's nonsense. Dabrowski said there's a quantitative and a qualitative difference between the animal and the human. The human can and must inhibit that which is lower. And that's the difference. Okay, thank you. Jeez, did I say all this stuff? In traditional theories of development, for example, Wilbur and all these other theories, Lovinger, Erickson, each successive stage or level is built on the shoulders of the previous one. So it's an integrative model. Dabrowski said no. Dabrowski said you can't base what is higher on that which is lower. You have to disintegrate the lower level, transform it, or replace it, and create a new higher function that may be completely anti-theoretical to the lower level. So you may not be able to use those pieces in the higher construction. You certainly can't build what's higher on what is lower. Does that make sense? New view of reality, okay? So, again, echoing Plato, Dabrowski said that multi-levelness reflects literally a different, new view of reality. A view based on vertical appreciation. To say, I'll give you a good analogy. The panel and I and Joe are on one level. That's uni-level. Right? That guy in the back is higher than I am. That's multi-level. And I can differentiate and I can say, okay, what's the difference between Dexter and I? Well, really, there's no difference because we're on the same level. But that guy over there, he's on a different level. And if you see life just on one level, you're in trouble. There are metaphysical aspects of Dabrowski. This is tough to understand because Dabrowski would say, well, third factor. Third factor comes from genetics, but then it transcends genetics. What? How can it transcend genetics? Well, because it's an emergent factor. As it emerges, it becomes greater than itself, and it changes. Next, please. Okay, now, in 1958, Marie Jehoda was given the job of writing a task force, and she wrote a book that nobody read. I have to preface this by saying that it's something else. In 1954, Maslow did his major book. Okay? In the back of Maslow's book, nobody seems to understand this anymore, history seems to be forgotten. Maslow wrote an appendix to his book that talked about positive psychology. Okay? It's like 40 pages. Martin Seligman did not invent positive psychology. Oh my God, what a shock. Okay? Csikszentmihalyi and Martin Seligman did not invent positive psychology. It was first written about in detail by Maslow in 54. Then, following on the footsteps of that, Jehoda in 58 does this task force. And she says, listen, you can't define mental health on the basis of the absence of symptoms. It's not good enough. You've got to define mental health on the basis of something that is there. Okay? She came up with 6 criteria. Dabrowski was influenced by these criteria. Dabrowski refers to Jehovah. Okay? Number one, you have to have adequate self-perception. Number two, you have to have a degree of growth and development. And she used Maslow's concept of self-actualization. Number three, there's an integrative aspect to it. Number four, autonomy. 5, perception of reality. And 6, environmental mastery. Okay, next please. How did Bart get in there? Dabrowski said the same thing. You cannot define mental health by the absence of symptoms. You have to define mental health by the presence of a growth aspect, an aspect of authenticity. A psychopath is not mentally healthy because he's not an authentic human being. Okay? You have to look at how people ought to be. And again, you cannot look at a statistical norm and say, okay, well, this is the average person. Therefore, we'll take a look at 2 standard deviations on an MMPI and say the person is crazy. That's not how it should be. So Dabrowski would say, well, how ought people be? And that should be the criteria that we use to define mental health. Next, please. Now, this led to a very, I would say, unusual formulation. The average person does not have personality because the average person functions at a very low level of autonomy. They function within a society. And that means that Dabrowski used the phrase, the average person had a group personality. Of course, this is from Nietzsche. Nietzsche talks about the personality of the herd. And if you're not an individual, and you're socialized, and you're running on factor 2, then you've got the personality of the guy next to you, essentially. I'm going to talk about Bergson a little bit in this talk because I must apologize to Dexter. Dexter gave me Bergson's book, Creative Evolution, first edition, I think it was 6-7 years ago. I didn't read it. But I read it, I've read everything Bergson said in January, February, March. And again, I emphasize, if you're interested in Dabrowski, read Bergson because it's very interesting stuff. And Bergson says the same thing. He says the average person, now I'm going to use an analogy here. The average person is sort of like people swimming in the ocean. Factor 2 makes us good swimmers. We're swimming around there, we're having fun. We've got people all around us. People swim one way, I swim with them. It's like a lighted school of fish, right? We all go the same direction, back and forth. Okay, we're having a great time. Bergson would say, hey, that is so superficial as to be meaningless. It's so superficial, it's meaningless. So Bergson would say, in order to understand, or in order to connect to, or in order to learn your personality, you have to dive under the surface. You have to go 100 feet down in the ocean. And all of a sudden, there's nobody there. All of a sudden, there's no community. There's no communication. There's no way to communicate. Your familiarity is gone because you're down 100 feet, now it's dark down there. That's yourself. And few people take the dive. Few people go down that far. And to establish autonomy, to discover autonomy, you have to take that dive. And you have to take it one-on-one. And Bergson says that's tough to do. Dabrowski says that's not very common. And that's why we have personality troubles. Next, please. Multi-levelness is a process. Hierarchization is a process. How do I get from here up there? Well, I'm not going to get there at all. Okay, unless you help me carry me up the stairs. But how does a person get from here to there? It's a process. And it's a process of vertical differentiation. Okay, next please. 5 levels, blah, blah, blah. Next please. Level 1. Dabrowski said, and he didn't say this anywhere in writing, but he said that about 65% of the population, in his opinion, was somewhere in uni-level primary integration. Now, I noticed that in Pajkowski's 2014 article, he quotes that at 70%. As a student, I remember Dabrowski saying 65. That's the number I use. And people say, oh my God, that's elitist. That's a put-down. If 65% of people have no personality, what's put-down? Dabrowski would not say that. Dabrowski would say, my God, 35% of people have potential. That's tremendous. That's really good. It's a very stable, horizontal level. Behavior is often automatic, rote. You cry at funerals because other people cry at funerals. You don't go to funerals now. Your behavior follows along. It's got stereotypic behavior. That is to say, it follows along. It's based on 2 factors, factor 1 and factor 2. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. It's a difficult level to break free of because there is security in swimming with the pack. At a previous conference, I said, I'm a music fan. And Don Vanderlei was a blues musician. And he said, if you want to be a different kind of fish, you've got to jump out of the school. You can't swim with the school of fish and be different. Okay? But that pack, let's face it, we are, my analogy here is dogs. We are a social pack animal, just like dogs. The lone dog is insecure, and it's hard to break out of that feeling of running your own path. Bergson says the same thing. Bergson says you follow the path because it's easy and it's secure. It's easy. Next. Okay, so other people have said the same thing. Ken Wilber describes it as, what's it say? I can't read it with the glasses. Flatlanders. That's Wilber. Berlanfi and Jablonski, Louis Jablonski, call him robopaths. There's a wonderful short story by Saint-Exupéry. It talks about a child on a train coming back from the day's work, the day's labor. And the train is full of these hard workmen. Think of the men coming out of a mine. They're dirty and their hands are filthy and they're tired and they're slumped over in their train cars. And there's this little boy in the train car, and Saint-Exupéry says, there is a Mozart murdered, okay? Because it's just there. These folks tend to follow along because it's easier. It's a strictly behavioristic model. And again, I emphasized I mentioned von Bertalanffy. And von Bertalanffy was a genius, oh my God. And his brother was a genius too. His brother was a cancer genius. They're both from Saskatchewan. The brother discovered a carcinogenic embryonic antigen. And Bertalanffy himself was a theoretical biologist. But he said the same thing. He said, this is rattlomorphic psychology. Which way is the rat going to run in the maze? And you cannot understand personality by looking at behavior. Okay, next. No, just a minute. Skinner's black box, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, another thing that Bertalanffy emphasized. Hey, I've got choices, right? Do I? Okay. Well, let's say I'm looking for a car. I want to buy a Chev or a GM or a Ford or a Chrysler. What choices have I got? Wow, what a variety of choices. But in reality, that's not a choice at all. They're all the same automobile, really. They just have different names. A choice might be more appropriate to say, do I want an automobile or do I want a bicycle? Or, for example, do I want a gas-operated automobile or do I want an electric car now? That's a choice. But we function under the illusion of choice. We think we have choices. Okay? Conflicts, okay. Good. Conflicts are between the same choices. I don't know whether to go left or right. That's unilevel. There's no up and down in unilevel. It's left or right. Yeah?
When I heard Bill a long time ago, I remember these choices, and he said, it's like the Monday night. Should I watch football or go to the opera with my wife?
Did I say that? Okay, another thing that's critically important is generally speaking, there's a low level of consciousness. I'm not conscious of the fact that, there's 60 people here. I'm not conscious of that. I'm not conscious of myself. I'm not self-conscious. I'm not self-aware. I go along. I'm flowing with the flow. But I'm really unconscious. And Dexter's probably going to talk about that a little bit from the Buddhist perspective. This whole thing is just a big illusion. Okay? I think I'm conscious. But in actuality, I only scratch the very bare surface of consciousness. Really. Next, please. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, you have to understand something about this. Dabrowski talked about integration. Okay, yes. Michael Stone was a personality expert. He said, personality is like a chest of drawers. You may scratch the surface of the chest and you make a mark. Personality can be maybe sanded down, maybe refurnished a little bit, but you're kind of stuck with the finish you've got. It can be tinkered with, but you're stuck with it. I think William James said that personality was set like plaster at about age 40. If you take a look at the contemporary research on personality change, generally speaking, there's a lot of controversy in it. I mean, there's the left and the right. But generally speaking, they don't talk a lot about personality change after the age of 30, 25, 30. Okay? So one of the characteristics of a unilevel person is a rigidity to resist change. Elizabeth Micah differentiated level 1 very nicely. Dabrowski himself differentiated level 1 into two distinct types. At the very lowest, Dabrowski said was the psychopath, and then the average person. Elizabeth read more of the whole issue and came up with this little illustrative hierarchy at the bottom here, where at the very bottom you've got a psychopath, what you and I would understand as a psychopath. A person who takes what they want, steals things, has no scruples, has no compunction of breaking the law, robbing banks, I mean, antisocial. Antisocial. Then you have a whole another group of psychopaths that go along to get along. Okay. I don't have this reference in here, but it's easily found. Surveys of college males, college-age males at universities show that something along the lines of 40% say they would rape a woman if they knew they could get away with it. Okay. I read a study the other day, a couple of months ago, Canadian Medical Association Journal, that looked at Canadians and said that 32% of Canadians report child abuse in their backgrounds. 32%. Well, for every victim, there's a perpetrator. So, Babiak and Hare, H-A-R-E, talk about the corporate psychopath. Okay, the guy that really dog eat dog. How did I get to be CEO? Come on. The other day I watched this movie on Steve Jobs. Aston Kutcher is the actor. You want to know how Steve Jobs got to be president of Apple? By screwing over all of his friends. That's how he got there. That's psychopathic. But the guy ran out. I use a Mac. Well, what can you say? Then there's the average person who's conforming. So the average person is governed by factor 2. Factor 2 is conformity. Okay? And then there's the average person who has psychoneurotic tendencies. Now we're talking. The average person who has breakthroughs of anxiety, has breakthroughs of depression, has breakthroughs of angst. Sal said that Dabrowski saved my life. I think that's probably true. When I was 23, I had no direction. I was just all energy. I had a lot of anxiety. I had a lot of angst. I didn't know where it came from. I had a lot of trouble. And at one time I remember saying to Dabrowski, I've got all this anxiety, I don't know what to do. And he said, and I don't know how to imitate him, but he said, but this is not so bad. I thought I was freaking dying. So Dabrowski gave me a context to understand my personality characteristics that challenged me and allowed me to have a vertical growth out of the quicksand. I didn't remain stuck at the uni level. I was able to see higher and aspire. That's what saved my life. Okay. Next. Just a minute. So then there's disintegration. I'm not going to talk about this very much. Disintegration, there's different types and different degrees of disintegration. Dabrowski describes this very nicely. The key point here is the difference between unilevel and multi-level. Okay. Now, I'll give you an example of a unilevel disintegration. This is the unilevel disintegration. I don't really have my thumb very good. I might actually do this. This is a unilevel disintegration happening right now as we speak. Oh my God. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay, I'm fine.
I can't back up now because I don't have my thumb. Reno, I don't have my thumb, buddy. Thank you. Thank you. There, reverse. I'm in control again. That's a uni-level disintegration. A multi-level disintegration is when you have a conflict between a lower level and a higher level. Okay? That's the $64 deal. Do I go and watch the football with my buddies on Monday night and have a beer? Or do I go with my wife to the ballet and see what that's all about? Do you think that's a good example? Well, I don't know. Sal, do you have a better example?
That's pretty good.
Well, I looked for a long time for a wife who enjoyed football, but I couldn't find one. That raises a whole other question. Mate selection. You know, they've just done a study the other day, yesterday, came out. Gene sequencing nowadays, they have these computers that do gene sequencing. And they're showing now that partners have more similar genetic genomes than strangers. That's interesting. Next, please. Again, development in multi-levelness is linked to a new view of reality. I'm not just looking across the pond. I'm looking from the bottom of the valley up to the top of the mountain. And trust me, that's a big difference. Okay? Now, again, this creates a whole different perspective of behavior. Okay? And I'm going to elaborate this as we go forward. Next. Dabrowski said this was everything. It's like Hillary's step on Everest. If you can get over this, you're done. You're okay. The rest is easy. Next. Secondary integration. Again, to emphasize, you don't spend the rest of your life having conflicts and having stress and having disintegration. Once you establish who you are, it becomes easier. Now, I promise I'm not going to talk about myself very much, but I'll give you an example. No, I'm not going to give it here. I'm going to give it later. Let's go. Personality. Self-chosen. Who are you? Most people are de facto. What does that mean? Most people are just themselves. Well, I'm me. I just woke up in the morning and here I am, right? Dabrowski said that's not good enough. Personality is chosen. Who do you want to be? Who do you feel you ought to be? Okay? Next, please. Now, this is my cat, Ted. Actually, AKA Teddy, AKA Teddy Bear, or if he's been bad, Thaddeus. It's a serious question. If my cat can achieve secondary integration, which he seems to be pretty content with, and if 35% of people have developmental potential, what's wrong? Now, traditional theories say, like Wilbur says, or Maslow says, or Freud says, the average person has the potential, but life is tough, and life wears you down, and you run out of gas, and that's why you don't achieve growth. That's why you don't achieve the highest level, because you run out of gas. Dabrowski had a different idea. Dabrowski said, no, not everybody has the potential. Developmental potential is a genetic trait. Not everybody has it. Okay? So there's two explanations as to why people don't achieve higher levels than they do. But again, I challenge you. Why not? Why can't we? What can we do? Next, please. Go back one. See, that's the expert model. I don't know if you can see it at the top. I threw some Latin in there. Linus Catalinus. Anybody who's really Latin would know that that's what I just thought I would address people. That's the illusion of expertise. Let me say that again. That's the illusion of expertise. That's factor 2. Okay? I was saying to somebody today, if Tony Robbins was here, you know Tony Robbins, don't you? He could go blah, 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 and you'd say, oh my God, that's Tony Robbins. Isn't he wonderful? Because that's the illusion of expertise. Next, please. Now, this creates a hell of a problem. If you've got different levels, and you've got different dimensions, then you've got to measure each dimension on each level. It goes back to what I said at the beginning. How can you measure multi-levelness with a uni-level approach? Makes it tough. Next, please. For example, look at the different dimensions you could think about measuring. You could, for example, you could measure the 3 factors. What level are you operating on factor 1, 2, and 3? You could look at something like asceticism, conscientiousness, boundary levels. You could look at something like creativity. This conference is about creativity. Have you got level 1 creativity? Well, I'll tell you what, I've really worked my way up. I'm an chemical engineer. I did my PhD in a special area of chemistry. I got a job with Dow Chemical, and I was able to invent Agent Orange. Pretty good, eh? That's level 1 creativity. That's level 1 creativity. Okay. Michelangelo was level 4 or 5 creativity. See the difference? You could look at the 5 overexcitabilities on the different levels. You could look at something like empathy, as Amanda Harper did. You could look at something like emotionality, or the 5-factor model, or common sense. A very much overlooked. Sternberg just wrote a book on why intelligent people do dumb things. Because they have no common sense. Okay. You have level 1 common sense or level 4 common sense. Next, please. Next, please. Now I'm going to skip over these altogether. These are definitions. They're on the internet. I'm not, excuse me, just about, Sal, I just about did one. Unamuno was a Spanish philosopher, one of Dabrowski's favorites. Unamuno said, I'm not here to sell you bread. I'm here to give you yeast. So if you want these definitions, look them up. Thank you. Next. 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 Crisis. What is the role of crisis in life? Every authentic, creative process is a breakdown of the rigidity, a splitting, a smashing of the form of reality. Wow. Every mental conflict is associated with disruption and pain. Somebody said to me at a neuro conference, we like this Dabrowski guy, but we don't like all this suffering. Okay. Authentic existence involves shocks and sorrows Lama is going to talk about joy and sorrow. I don't know how high I am because I've never experienced the low. You can't have one without the other. You can't have perception of joy without having experienced pain. Okay, next please. The role of crisis. Blah, blah, blah. Next please. Now, experiences of shock, stress, and trauma may accelerate development in individuals with developmental potential. Okay? Leading to existential crises. A guy in a boat with a rhinoceros is experiencing an existential crisis. This is a scene from a movie by Fellini. Next, please. Crises are periods of increased insight into oneself, creativity, and personality development. How can that be? I'm in a crisis, I think I'm going to commit suicide. How can that be creativity? How can that be insight? Because crises challenge us to come up with the real stuff that makes me me. It challenges my character, and my character emerges as a result of the challenge. I spent a year looking at Apocalypse Now. I watched it 50, 60 times, 100 times. I watched the first half, then the second half. Apocalypse Now has nothing to do with Vietnam, of course. It's the story of Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. And it is the story of the Fisher King and the story of the Holy Grail. Okay. The land is diseased. The king calls for the prince to come and slay the dragon and find the grail and restore the land. And as a prize, he gets the princess. But that doesn't happen because he doesn't find the grail. It's the process that creates the character development. The prince becomes, well, I shouldn't say prince, the knight becomes the king by slaying the dragon and by discovering himself. The knight is tempted along the way to find the grail by the 7 deadly sins. He's tempted by anger. He's tempted by, I don't remember right now, sloth and all this stuff. He's tempted. He must resist temptation. He must be a good character. And in the process, he discovers his character. And as his character emerges, he emerges as a higher individual than he started out. As Kurtz goes up the river, as Willett goes up the river to find Kurtz, he discovers himself and he emerges at the other end. At the beginning, he says, I'm a soldier. I do my duty. That's factor 2. That's factor 2. By the end of the movie, he says, hey, I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this for me. That's factor 3. Okay? And he discovers that by the journey. Next, please. Oh, by the way, that's big. Go ahead. We're human. Oh my God. We might not be human. We're human in as much as we experience disharmony, dissatisfaction, and disintegration. Okay? Prolonged states of uni-level disintegration lead either to a reintegration or progress or suicide or psychosis. You cannot stand the process of uni-level disintegration for long. Dabrowski described it as a transitionary state. Now, that's a surprise. If you've learned the theory in the United States, you might understand that the average person is at level 2. Not according to Dabrowski. Okay? It's a sharp, intense period of crisis. You either escape back, or you push forward, or you are really literally risking craziness or death. Dabrowski's example, I think you're right, as I'm talking, I think you're right, that you have to hear out what the analogies, right? Yeah, you just can't read it. Right? Dabrowski's example of Clifford Beers. Clifford Beers was a man who lost his sanity and went over the edge and became insane. And in those days, they had no place to put you in those days. Well, that's not true. Clifford Beers was well-to-do, and he was, instead of being put in an asylum for crazy people, which at that time was just terrible, they put him in a tuberculosis sanatorium. And he spent 5 years in a tuberculosis sanatorium. And then he recovered his function. Clifford Beers went on to establish the American mental health movement. And he wrote a book called A Mind That Found Itself. So again, there's an example of somebody who was in a severe state of crisis leading to psychosis, and he eventually came out of it and grew and wrote a book and became very instrumental in the American mental health movement. And interestingly, I'm going to mention this. I know I'm going to be late here today, but I'm going to just keep talking. It's important. Clifford Beers had a very similar figure in Canada, and that was Richard Maurice Buck, who established the mental health movement in Canada, in Ontario, where he said, listen, we don't want mentally ill people held in chains, literally held in chains. And he wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness. He was friends with Walt Whitman, and he's a very important figure in Canadian history that nobody knows about. Richard Maurice Buck, B-U-C-K-E. Next, please. Back, please. Read the last line. Inner conflict is the result of the process of positive disintegration and the operation of the dynamisms of development. Next, please. Well, dinosaur, dynamite, dynamism, what the heck is that? What's a dynamism? Well, back in the old days, before I was here, dynamism was a term that was used in psychoanalysis and in psychiatry to refer to the forces that move people. Why do you do what you do? Before behaviorism and before Skinner got popular and before J.B. Watson got popular, they talked about dynamisms as being emotions that moved people, okay? And the idea was that if you understood the dynamisms that were behind people, you'd understand what they were about. And so psychoanalysis was considered a psychodynamic theory. Okay? Now, Dabrowski talked about dynamisms a lot. And he talked about it as being a biological or mental force controlling behavior, and then at the end, it's very important, combined with emotion. Combined with emotion. Next, please. Internal conflict, low at level 1, because, hey, I'm never in trouble, I'm a good boy. I don't have to worry about internal conflict. I do what I'm told. Do I question it? Never. Why would I question it? My dad taught me never to question authority. My dad taught me if I want to get ahead, I just have to do what I'm told, be a good boy and not get into trouble. Maximum mental disharmony is at level 2. I think I'm going crazy. Okay? And then again at level 5, 4 and 5, you have less because, hey, I'm doing what I think I ought to do. Now, ironically, at the higher levels, you have much more external conflict. 10 years ago, I would have handed out 100 pages to everybody. I would have. Why not? This is important, take it home. Well, now I see that that's not good for the environment. So I have less inner conflict now because I'm more aware of the environment. And my external conflict would be say, hey, listen, let's recycle those tin cans. I become a political activist, say, or I become a social activist, or I become an advocate. I'm an advocate for health. I'm a volunteer for muscular dystrophy and for Canadian paraplegic, and people need help. So that is external conflict because you fight the system. But I enjoy doing it, so I have less internal conflict. Okay, next please. Psychoneurosis. Those processes, syndromes, and functions that express the inner conflicts. This is a picture of the actor Koskinski from the Werner Herzog movie Fitzcarraldo, which is a wonderful movie about positive maladjustment. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please.
Bill, just a question.
Yep.
Almost an hour and a half. You
Yep.
want to take a 10 or 15 minute break and then come back?
Do you need a break? Please say no. Next.
Twice as great.
Next. Next. Developmental potential is relatively uncommon. Okay. Some people seem to have equivocal developmental potential where the environment is huge. The environment makes a difference. I had not a very supportive environment. I wish I had been my dad. I didn't have a very good dad. But I had enough developmental potential, it didn't matter. I overcame it. Nothing could hold me back. And when I saw my father abusing my mother, and when I saw him behaving that way, I said to myself, I'm not going to be like that. That gave me stimulus. That gave me motivation. That gave me impetus to say, I don't have to be that way. Right? And as a 5-year-old, when my father was beating my brother up and kicking me on the kitchen floor, I said to myself, why is he doing that? Why is he doing that? I don't understand that. Why is he doing that? But I had enough developmental potential to push through. If I'd had less, that environment could have killed me. Okay, next please. Where are we today? 65%. I'll go on next. Developmental potential. For what we all know, developmental potential is overexcitability, right? Next, please. Here's developmental potential. The 3 factors of development, the dynamisms, psychoneurosis, and positive disintegration are considered part of developmental potential. Emerging factors, like the third factor, the hierarchy of values, the hierarchy of aims and goals, okay? The interpsychic milieu and personality ideal. What is personality ideal? It's the personality I would like to achieve. It's my imaginary goal of who I would like to be. It gives me something to aspire to. You may be shocked to hear this. Of course, I can provide references if you're into that kind of stuff. Maslow said, don't try to aspire, because it's frustrating, and when you fail, you'll feel guilty. So don't aspire. Be all you could. Now, this is interesting in the United States. They use this as the slogan for the Army. Maslow literally said, be all you can be. That's the slogan for the Army, right? Or the Navy, or whatever. Be all you can be. But then he said, but no more. Don't aspire. That's crazy. Instincts are part of developmental potential. Of course, oversight ability. And the other aspect is special talents and abilities. We very seldom hear about all this list on developmental potential. Next. Oh my God. Do I have to speak about this? Yes?
Yeah. On the developmental potential, I think it's probably useful to distinguish between developmental potential as a causal factor
Yes.
and developmental potential as a diagnostic assessment. So that, and in terms of causes, you can't have the developmental potential creating the very hierarchy, because that's what that is the development. So the potential has to be something antecedent to these advanced dynamisms. On the other hand, if you're using it as a diagnostic method, then the presence,
Yes.
even embryonic,
Yes.
of various dynamisms
Yes.
is an indicator that this person
Yes.
is engaged in a process of growth and has the potential.
I.e.
to
has
move
potential.
beyond.
Has potential.
Yeah.
Now again, there's a differentiation there between when you develop, you're transforming your potential into something else. You're actualizing your potential. My physics teacher, Mr. Masterman, taught me that potential energy was a brick on a shelf. When that brick falls down off the shelf, it becomes kinetic energy. Potential, when you actualize potential, I hate to use the word actualize because people always think Maslow, but Lori, you're right. When you put potential to use and it leads to development, it becomes something else. It's not potential anymore, it's development. Is that your point?
My point is that there are certain temperamental characteristics that are antecedent and causal of the various developmental dynamisms.
Yes.
But you can't use the dynamisms as potential for dynamisms.
Yes.
That's circular thing.
Yes.
So they're good for they serve a diagnostic purpose. Anyway, I don't want to distract you.
No, that's good. I'm with you.
Overall.
I'm with you, and I appreciate the question. Please don't hesitate to ask questions, because that's how we learn. That's how I learn. I think you're right. Now, why have I put this up here? All right, next. Dabrowski talked about a couple of different things. He talked about IQ varying in the population. And this is actually funny to me because I think it was Peter Slavoni who coined the expression EQ, in emotional quotient. And then Daniel Goleman actually was a New York journalist who wrote a book on emotional intelligence, and he popularized it. But Dabrowski talked about that back in my day. Like Dabrowski talked to us about emotional quotient. And he said it's just common sense that it varies. Some people have it, a lot of it, and some people don't. And the same thing here with developmental potential. Some people exhibit it and some people don't. Okay, next please. Next please. Next. I just mentioned this. Dabrowski had a very unusual vocabulary, a lexicon, a jargon, and he defined it quite articulately. He had a glossary in the 1970 book, and he also had a glossary in the 1972 book. They're not quite identical, but they're interesting. Then he had a whole book on concepts, the dynamics of concepts, explaining what he meant by these different ideas. And so if you want to learn Dabrowski, you have to learn the lexicon. You know, if you want to be a nuclear physicist, you've got to talk about quarks and quarks and all that stuff. Next, please. Next. I don't know if I need to say this, it's sort of self-obvious, but I think this group should know this. Individuals with imaginational, intellectual, and emotional have the big three, Dabrowski called it. Next. Dabrowski linked overexcitability with disintegration. Okay? He linked it to disintegration through psychoneurosis. Overexcitability leads to the discovery that the little boy puts his fist into the hornet's nest. That leads to disintegration. Okay? Now, can you read that? If you said to me, what characterized my youth? Of course, I would say to you, yes, I had all 5 overexcitabilities, which is a pain in the ass. But I had 2 other characteristics that killed me. One, I had curiosity. And I'm not sure if that's covered under intellectual or not. If somebody was doing something, I wanted to watch. I wanted to meet people. I wanted to participate. I wanted to look over somebody's shoulder. I was insatiable, and I still am. The other thing that killed me was I had a photographic memory. I saw images that today haunt me. I can't get them out of my mind. So I had a terrible time with that. I'll give you a couple of another example here. Everything I say about myself illustrates the theory, and so I'm not just, you know. I was very afraid of fire, hysterically afraid of fire, and I handled this when about grade 8, I think it was, probably about 10, 12 years old maybe. I started learning about firefighting. And I read books on firefighting. Dabrowski would call that auto education. And the other thing I did was my brother and I had cameras, and I would go around to all the different cities we went to, and I would photograph fire engines. And so, to me, that's all psychotherapy. I was photographing, I like the big engines because they were the ones that put the fires out faster. But I had a collection of pictures of fire engines. My favorite was truck number 5 from Seattle, but number 9 from Spokane was a nice one. I'll buy that. I think it was a Ponderosa restaurant there. Anyways, they're beautiful, all our trucks. But that's how I handled my phobia of fire. That's auto psychotherapy and auto education. But should curiosity be an overexcitability? I don't know. Bill Hague said spirituality should be an overexcitability. Because some people have an insatiable need to discover spirituality and explore spirituality. Next, please. Next. Now, in 1979, it might have been 1978, Michael Pachowski was at a conference. And he told me the story that he was roomed with Nicholas Colangelo. And Nicholas Colangelo had just been finishing his PhD in gifted, and they were roomed together. And before this time, Michael never talked about gifted. Okay? He never wrote about gifted. His thesis was not on gifted. His thesis was on a conceptual analysis of psychotherapeutic techniques. He met Colangelo, and Colangelo said, look, I'm putting together a book on counseling gifted students. And I like this idea of developmental potential. Overexcitability turns me on. I see it in my kids. Will you do a chapter for me? And Pachowski said, yes, that chapter went in the 1979 book that was quite an influential book in gifted education, New Voices in Counseling the Gifted, by Colangelo and Zaffram. And that was the first introduction of gifted, that gifted had to Dabrowski, and it was just on developmental potential. Michael did not believe in some of the aspects of Dabrowski's theory, and he left them out. And he rationalized, as he told me, educators don't want to hear about positive disintegration. So he left it out. Okay? Research zeroed in on overexcitability, in part because Lysy and Pachowski developed the first version of the overexcitability questionnaire, which was a cumbersome instrument where they would ask people, and then they had raters try to rate the responses and come up with a level. And, oh, by the way, I'm a level 2.751. But that made them feel good, I guess. Now, over the past 30 years, research has looked at different populations, mostly gifted, some on artists, but mostly gifted. The construct validity of these instruments is a huge problem that's never discussed. Research has been inconsistent, and I don't care what you listen to. If you read it, be an archaeologist, take your shovel and dig, you will not find a consensus that these instruments support the big three. Next, please. Now, is anybody in this room love Dabrowski? Hands up. Yes? Good. Is anybody in this room suicidal? Because trust me, the next 5 slides will push you over the edge. I'm sorry to say that this is all true. I haven't made any of it up. Overexcitability is a mangled concept in the gifted literature. Here's an example. Here's overexcitability portrayed as a vulnerability of people. Here's, according to Dabrowski's clinical observations, people with overexcitabilities are neurotically allergic. Wow, I learn so much when I read things. I've never heard of that. Neurotically allergic? What is that? Then there's the idea of circuitous referencing. Why would anybody say this? The concept of overexcitability was introduced by Dabrowski, 1938, cited in Pachowski and Colangelo. Well, why not cite Dabrowski? In English. He did write books in English. Next, please. I might get depressed. I love it. In Dr. Dabrowski's day, overexcitabilities were thought to be the core trait of personality development. Period. End of story. We all know that. Researchers have broadened the idea and applied it to the gifted and talented students. Overexcitability is correlated to IQ It predicts cognitive abilities, correlations between between overexcitability and gender, overexcitability and age. It predicts creativity, creative personalities, and it predicts psychological adjustment. And it can also butter your bread in the morning. I mean, come on, okay. And how do we know this? Because research has shown it. Okay, next. Dabrowski, and again, Securitas referencing here, indicated 5 dimensions of blah, blah, blah. Now, I must have been asleep the day that Dabrowski talked about pose and mo's and toes and O's. I'm sorry. That's not Dabrowski. What's the quote say? Dabrowski indicated, and there it is in black and white, must be true, right? Now, at the bottom, I say this. Guide myself. I'm not going to give examples of Pachowski's latest paper, which was a Roper Review article that he did in the spring of 2014. I'm not going to give specific examples from that paper. There's a long standing difference between the two authors, and suffice to say, that paper has many, many points that are controversial that I could have picked on, but I didn't. That's it? Okay, next slide, please. My list of intensities uses the word creative intensity. This not only better describes intensity, but enables an acronym called SPICE, because we all know that overexcitabilities are the spice of life. These intensities correspond to the symptoms of ADHD perfectly, except that they're positive and not negative. And finally, Dabrowski called the third element exactly what I've been describing throughout the book, intensity. This is a fairly popular new book that talks about ADHD as not existing. And it's got a lot of Dabrowski in it, and it ain't Dabrowski. Okay? And she literally says that overexcitability equals ADHD, therefore we shouldn't talk about ADHD, we should talk about overexcitabilities. And she mangles the third factor, of course. The third factor is not intensities, but I don't know. She's got a book and I don't. So she must be important, right? There's the illusion of expertise again. Next. These heightened and intense characteristics, known as overexcitabilities, are claimed as universal characteristics of gifted individuals. They are. Well, she quotes Webb, and I looked at Webb, and I can't find where Webb said that. Next. Susan, help me here. According to Daniels and Meckstroff, Dabrowski had stated that an individual who possesses more than one overexcitability is gifted and talented.
To the best of my knowledge, that is not in my chapter.
Well, I couldn't find it. I'm confused. Why couldn't I find it? This lady, this guy found it, right? Okay. These overexcitabilities form the foundation of Dabrowski's theory, a theory of self-actualization. Okay, next please. Where are we going here? Where are we going? At the beginning of this talk, I called for a revitalization. I challenged you to return to Dabrowski. This is nonsense. This is what's being published. These references are in journals. These are 2013 and 14 references. What's wrong? I said on the internet the other day, we've got to do something about it. Josh Shane said, why? That's life. Well, I don't accept that. I'm positively maladjusted. This has created a vertical disintegration. What does that mean? I'll explain it to you very clearly. I see what is, and I reject it. I can see what ought to be, and I'm going to try to achieve it. That's a multi-level conflict. Right there. Next, please. Get a grip. Read Mendagio. Number 2. Oh my God. Dabrowski described overexcitability as a discontinuous construct. It's not normally distributed in the population. Okay? And the 5 overexcitabilities are not independent variables. So you cannot use t-testing, or you cannot use p-scores, you cannot use analysis that's meant for ratio data on ordinal measures. Likert scales are ordinal measures. 1 to 5. All I can say in that information is that 4 is ahead of 3. I don't know how much ahead. I don't know how much ahead 5 is ahead of 4. It's not ratio data. It's ordinal data. That makes a lot of the analysis that's being used meaningless. Throw it out. Now, the majority of the problems I see today that I've just described in the last 5 slides are just based on sloppy research. If you're going to write an article on Dabrowski, read Dabrowski. And if you're the editor of a journal, or if you're the reviewer of a journal, and you get this crap handed to you, you should reject it. It's as simple as that. This is not an opinion. I don't care if people say, I do not agree with Dabrowski. I love that, because that's academic discourse. Okay? But don't say this. Don't say, you know what? Dabrowski believed in the marshmallow theory. Well, you all know what that is, right? If you eat marshmallows, then you increase your developmental potential. Everybody knows that. Right? Don't write a theory or a paper that says Dabrowski said that, because he didn't say it. Okay? You can't say, it's inappropriate to say that Dabrowski was wrong just because you don't agree with what he said. He wrote a theory. His theory may be wrong, but who am I to say he made a mistake when he wrote his theory? It's his theory. And if I think he's wrong, I should write my own theory. Okay? And my theory will include the marshmallow theory of developmental potential. But I'm not going to call that Dabrowski's. Okay? I'm not going to make that mistake because it's inappropriate. It's inappropriate for me to say this. Well, if Dabrowski had known about marshmallow theory, he would have endorsed it. That's crazy. That's wrong. But people say that. Okay? And the most egregious thing is to say, well, I'm going to give a paper on Dabrowski. I don't care what Dabrowski said. I'm going to put in what I think is important. So you're going to learn about the marshmallow theory whether you like it or not. But the title of the talk is going to be Dabrowski. That's just wrong. And I'm sorry to rail on I'm sorry, it's important to me, and I think it's an important message. Next, please. Next, please. Next. Third factor. Next, please. Now, this is a magazine cover from a Canadian magazine from last week. It talks about Generation Z. Well, for you Americans, Generation Z. And what it is people that are 18 years or under that are overachieving. Okay. Dabrowski said premature maturation was the enemy of third factor because people that have a lot of developmental potential take longer to mature. And if you rush to maturity, you cut off your development by a premature integration, by a premature rigidity characterizing integration. Your boundaries, as James would say, your boundaries must be as loose as possible for as long as possible in order for you to get the maximum growth that you can get out of yourself. And the more gas you have in the tank, the longer it takes. Dabrowski was counseling a girl that said, you know, at 24, whatever it is, I think I'm very immature. And Dabrowski said, of course, because you have much developmental potential. It's going to take you longer to mature. And in the ideal situation, Dabrowski would say, you're never going to mature. You're never going to reach a ceiling. You're never going to reach the maximum. I don't think I could reach that ceiling. Okay, next. Third factor starts out as something. I've heard third factor described to me as willpower or will. Well, we all know that. I think it was Adler that talked about will. So we know that. We don't have to pay attention to that. Well, that's not right. You talked about third factor as being deciding to turn your abilities on. That's not quite it either. Now, Dabrowski had a problem with third factor. He said it's a genetic thing. It's in your genes. But then, next please, it becomes something else. It emerges. It becomes a force in and of itself. And it becomes a developmental force. And again, this maybe talks about what Lori's talking about as well. At the beginning, third factor is a stirring, S-T-I-R, a stirring in you, but it eventually becomes a dominant force of development to be reckoned with. I'm going to give you an example of third factor that I think is relevant. When I was in grade 10 had to have phys-ed, and phys-ed had to have uniforms. And in the locker room, there were two groups of guys in the locker room. There was a group of abusers and a group of victims. And the abusers were trying to make you perform sexual favors for them. And so I went to the teacher. And I said, I'm not going to, you know, what can we do? I mean, I can't go in the locker room. Because I wasn't too fancy about being in either group. And the teacher said to me, you've got to face situations like this. This is part of being a man. Okay. So I went home and I said to my mother, I said, I'm not going to phys-ed. She said, okay. So I didn't go to phys-ed for a year. And at the end of the year, the principal went to my mother and said, we have a problem with Bill because we can't put him on to grade 11 because he has a 0 in phys-ed. And the county regulations are that we can't put him ahead with a 0. So Bill has to go to phys-ed, and I've made a deal with the teacher to give him 5% if he goes to phys-ed once, and we can pass Bill. And I never told my mother why I didn't go. I never told my mother. And my mother said to the principal, if Bill doesn't want to go, he doesn't have to go. Now, I believe that that was my first real brush with third factor. I am not going to submit to be a victim or a perpetrator. I'm going to be myself. And I believe that was the first time I can look back and say, you know, that's where it really expressed itself in a meaningful external way that had real consequences. And my mother just said, Bill will not go to phys ed, and Bill will pass. Yeah, yay. And Bill did pass. And I believe that was a real problem because I believe it was Jerry Sandusky was the coach that spent 20 years abusing his players, and the players were afraid to say anything. That's how that culture encourages pathology. Who's doing that? The average person? I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah. I spent 20 years in forensics hearing this. My God, how could he do that? He was such a nice guy. Okay, next please. I don't know what time it is, but I think I'm going to be okay.
3:30.
Good. Well, I'm going to have some time at the end. Next. Now, next. Next. Now, let's talk about this. There are 4 kinds of adjustment. Dabrowski looked at adjustment and said, current approaches to describe adjustment are not articulate enough. Therefore, we need to have more. And this is what he came up with. Negative maladjustment is first factor. I want it, I'm going to take it. If you have it and you're weak, I'm going to take it from you. That's first factor. We see that in marriages all the time. I dealt with inmates that were in on spousal charges. Males and females. Antisocial, asocial, egocentric, egotistical. Then we have negative adjustment. Kohlberg, Kohlberg, good boy, good girl. That's negative adjustment. I'm going to get along. I'm going to obey the orders. I'm going to, if the lieutenant tells me to kill the village, I'll kill the village. I'll kill the women, I'll kill the children, because that's what my lieutenant said. I'm going to go, I don't want to get into trouble. I want to get court-martialed? I don't want to get into trouble. That was the defense of Lieutenant Kelly in Melee massacre in Vietnam. I was ordered to do it and I did it. Okay. Adjustment to what is. Bergson said, people take their beliefs and adjustments and values like reading the news in the headline of the newspaper. They adopt it as casually as that. Okay? And then they don't think about it. Positive maladjustment, well, that's me. You know, if you see something wrong, you got to fix it. If you think that we're going the wrong direction, then say something. You should speak up. Speak out. Don't go along. You may be the only one. And you may be run over because of it. But you're doing the right thing. And finally, positive adjustment is when you do what you think is right because it's the right thing to do. Marlene Rankley used to talk about 4 different things. I did the wrong thing for the wrong reason. did the wrong thing for the right reason. I did the right thing for the wrong reason. Or I did the right thing for the right reason. That says it all. Next. Next. Now, Dabrowski was a student of Piaget. Okay. He did not reject cognitive approaches, but he didn't trust them. This is like taking the chemical engineer and putting him in charge of the war. I mean, yeah, Dr. Strangelove, right? We can bomb, yeah, let's bomb them, we'll get rid of them. Drop the bomb and we'll have a solution tomorrow. Intelligent? Yes. Moral? No. They don't have a compass. They don't have an emotional compass. For Dabrowski, you must have a combination of intellect in the service of emotion, because emotion tells you what to do. It's in my gut. I feel this is the right thing to do. Where do you feel it? In your head? No. That's an intellectual concept. And Dabrowski said, watch out, because you have peer pressure. Right? And psychological research on that is, you know, is the line long? Is this line longer or is that line longer? Peer pressure will make you submit. Your thoughts are not enough. You have to feel it in your gut. Okay, next. I'm not going to talk about this, I don't have time. But please read this on the internet. Ontogeny versus non-ontogeny growth. In one line, emotion does not follow stages of development the way intellect does. You may have an IQ of 1,000 and have an emotional quotient of 0. Next. And Dabrowski would say that's the worst thing. Dabrowski was very cautious of people that are very smart and have no emotion. Next. 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 Now, this is interesting. Dabrowski said at the higher levels, there's no difference between emotions and values because they're synonymous. I feel I'm doing the right thing. I don't think it, I feel it. The emotion becomes the value, and the value becomes the emotion. They reflect each other. Next, please. Okay, let's follow this just quickly. Emotion with hierarchization. Again, there's lower emotions and there's higher emotions. If I'm going to ask the question, before Frank came in, we talked about the OEQ, asking the question, do you experience great joy? Well, there's a difference between great joy at a low level and great joy at a high level. We must differentiate higher emotions from lower emotions. And if we're able to do that, then we're talking the same language, okay? Now, that creates a hierarchy of emotions that leads to a hierarchy of values. That hierarchy of values fine-tunes your personality ideal. Do I want to be a good person? What kind of person is that? I then develop an imaginary scenario. This is the kind of person I want to be. Okay? And that allows you to focus in on behavior. Then, the faithful expression of that personality leads to inner harmony. I can sleep at night because I said, no, I'm not going to become a perpetrator. And I'm not going to become a victim. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to rise above and do something different. And that allowed me to sleep at night. Okay, does that make sense? Next. Now, Dabrowski, contrary to what you might read, Dabrowski did not spend his life studying gifted children. Dabrowski reported one study of gifted children in all of his literature. One. And in that study, he said that every child showed hyperexcitability and psychoneurotic symptoms. Okay? This was his hypothesis. The development of personality with gifted children usually passes through the process of positive disintegration. Does it? We don't know. That's never been tested. Next. In the manuscript on authentic education, Dabrowski says this: the nervous and psychoneurotic individual is present in an overwhelming percentage of highly gifted children and youth. The tendency to reach beyond the statistical norm and the mediocre development presents the privilege and drama of the psychoneurotic. Read his poem on psychoneurosis. Next. Hypothesis. As a group, gifted children, students, will display stronger developmental potential, increased levels of psychoneurosis, and will be predisposed to disintegration. Next. This just talks about the history of the testing. OEQ is based on, Pyczalski developed OEQ based on a loose test that Dabrowski had. Ackerman did a PhD thesis on it. It was 40 pages. It was a good term paper. And it found that the OEQ was no good. And so then they came up with the OEQ2. Now, this is important. The manual of this test says this test is for group data. If you are a clinician, you should not be using the OEQ2 on an individual to determine anything. It is a research instrument to be used analyzing group data. That's in the manual. That's pretty standard stuff for tests that are just starting out. Okay. So if you're a clinician, resist. Next. Next. Back, I'm sorry. Next. Okay. Mike Pirate. You don't know Mike Pirate, maybe. Mike Pirate was a very extraordinarily intelligent person. Smarter than us. Trust me. Educated at Harvard. Statistician. If Mike Pirate told me to jump into a fire, I would, because I trust the man. He knows what he's talking about. Not only that, I'm going to say something else. Mike Pirate was a person of extraordinary character, an exemplar of development. And I know that because I knew him. That's not a platitude, it's a fact. Pirate did a meta-analysis of all the studies and said, yes, the gifted are more likely to show intellectual overexcitability. However, he could not show that the research supported the big three: imagination, emotion, and intellectual. He couldn't show that in a meta-analysis. He concluded, it appears that the gifted and average ability individuals have similar amounts of emotional overexcitability. This finding would suggest that many gifted individuals have limited developmental potential in the Dabrowskian sense of the word. Next, please. Now, Pirate concluded, it appears that gifted and average ability individuals have similar amounts of excitability, emotional excitability. Okay, in the Dabrowski, I'm sorry, repeat that. Oh, my mistake. I'm gonna have to fix that now. Don't you hate it when you make a mistake? Now, when you look at these references that I just cited before, none of them mention pirate. Why? Because it's a contrary finding. That's called research referencing bias. Okay? I'll give you a 30-second anecdote. The disease that I have is very complicated and it's very controversial because there are two groups of researchers that are looking at it. And one group think it's one thing and one group thinks it's another. And there was a guy by the name of Delacus. He was the head of neuromuscular at the Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. He was a big guy, right? He did 35 papers on this disease. Greenberg at Harvard analyzed his references and published a paper showing referencing bias. He only referenced his papers, making it look like there was an overwhelming support for his theory, which got him money from research grants. When that paper was published by Greenberg, Galactus was fired. That's the way it should work. Okay, next. This goes back to Ackerman. Ackerman did a nice little study here. Identified gifted with no developmental potential, 25%. Not identified as gifted, but with developmental potential, 35%. Her conclusion was, oh my God, there's 35% of the population that are gifted and have not been identified. Well, that's what she said. Next. Now, Nehart, 1999, and Tracy Cross as well, I think, talks about this. Sal knows more about this than I do. Talks about this. The gifted have no more stress, or no more mental health issues, or no more conflicts, or no more suicide than the average student. If that's the case, then what happened to Dabrowski's hypothesis that the gifted would have more disintegration? Maybe that's not supported either. We don't really know that because we don't have a good measure of disintegration, and nobody's ever really nobody's extensively looked at that in a research population. But clearly, it doesn't look like the gifted are going around committing suicide because they have tremendous positive disintegration. It doesn't look like that. Next. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. Next. Or, perhaps we should say, men shall learn wisdom by affliction schooled. I think my most important slide is coming out soon. Oh, here it is. This is an amalgamation, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Don't believe anything I've said. overcome your beliefs by verification. Bergson said, the average person will defend their beliefs and will be insulted if you question their beliefs. But the average person has a very superficial understanding of their beliefs. They do not hold their beliefs from any core position. They adopt them and then they defend them without thinking. Don't do that. Verify. Go and find out what I have said yourselves. Become an archaeologist of Dabrowski. Go and read his books. Challenge yourself and develop faith that you're on the right track. And if you can't do that, then find a different theory or whatever. Next. Thank you. Now, I would very much like some verification here. Any questions? Please we'll open this up to anybody here. There are experts in the audience and there are experts at the front that would try to take a crack at answering anything.
Will you be able to hear from the other experts?
Of course, please.
As a starting point? I'm really interested in the role you think play plays.
What?
I'm interested in the role that play plays.
Yes.
You mentioned curiosity and you
Yes.
talked about curiosity. So I'm wondering what that impulse to play.
Leo Moss wrote a paper on play, which you should read. It's probably on my desk. Vis-a-vis Dabrowski. Of course, play is rehearsal, right? And I would include in this category imaginary play. So I may imagine myself in a play scenario, or I may imagine an imaginary playmate. All of this is rehearsal, and it's critically important because a person who has imaginational overexcitability, this is a rehearsal for real life. And I believe that it's very important. And children that don't play and would rather text or play games on the computer, would miss that.
Tillier, at the risk of sounding self-serving, perhaps you could take Donica's suggestion and begin with...
Yes, please. Please.
I was invited to come for Q&A. I was invited to come and participate in Q&A towards the end of the presentation. I don't really have anything to add at this time, so let's go to Dexter.
And just thinking about play and its major forms,
Sorry, Dexter, you need to turn on the mic, I think.
Yeah, there's two mics on at once at the same time.
Dexter, just stand up and shout.
Yeah.
Just stand up and shout.
what are we doing now? I was just thinking about play, and usually play is, from a developmental view, has to do with one's personal play. It can be parallel play as children grow up. They play not so much with the other, but they play around the other, and then finally it can be social play where they do interact with each other, and there's dramatic play. And each of these kinds of play could have levels, and you can see levels probably of imagination overexcitability, emotional overexcitability, intellectual overexcitability, psychomotor overexcitability, etc. And I'm not sure, I don't remember Leo's paper,
Yeah.
but I'm sure that it's an excellent topic for a kind of Dabrowskian analysis in terms of overexcitabilities. So that's my input.
Did you have anything about the overall session? I think not.
I think what you said at the end was not to believe you, but to find out. And I think the issue is how much of us do understand Dabrowski, and so how much of us have tried to learn on Dabrowski. And so there is the literature out there, and it is an issue, and it has many things in it which other theories don't have. And he's not, he's trying to cover everything, in a sense, the whole range of human experience. So that's a big attempt, you know, but he does an interesting job, and his subjective approach, the whole issue around our own individual personal experience as we experience it, which is what Bergson kind of helps elucidate, and which is something that Bergson influenced Dabrowski, and we've had some other presentations around how Dabrowski was influenced by philosophers of his day and earlier philosophers, because he did study philosophy quite a bit as an undergraduate and so on. And so I think there's much to be learned in Dabrowski, and there's much to contemplate, and much richness to help us understand giftedness and many other things. And so that's kind of my view. Like, I would say that my view does not, is not coincident with Bell's view. It certainly follows along in many ways the way Bill expresses it. The examples he uses, I might use other examples, etc., just like anyone might. But I do think the issue is it's an important, interesting theory that can be understood, but you have to put the time in for it. And people involved with the various activities, their educational issues, their counseling issues, their research issues, and so on, may not have taken that opportunity to really study it, you know. And it doesn't take so much, but it does take some time, and it does have many things that are not similar than what you will find in other theories, and that's why it's been interesting.
So I guess a question here, I'm very new to this Dabrowski theory, and I've looked on the website, and the theory is a lot of academic literature, which even at a comprehension level has been harder for me to understand. So I would believe that if anybody tried to produce a closed note version, obviously you might be cutting out 95% of the theory. And I recognize that, you know, for those who really have the level of understanding and the time to kind of delve into it, they'll gain a lot more over their lifetime. But I was also thinking, has anybody actually ever attempted even maybe a smaller closed note version, so that even someone who can gain 5% insight can get them started on that path?
I think it exists. On most of our congresses and conferences begin with something like this, or some attempt to introduce people who don't have knowledge about the theory. And there have been many papers. I'm not sure where they are. I know that is our archivist, and they are in there somewhere. I'm not an academic, a very good academic, and I don't study and get into some of the kinds of issues around academic things. I use it in class, I use it in counseling, this theory, and what I've learned from my own experience. And it's that's an important thing about Dabrowski, is that by implicating us in his process, making us write in English what is positive maladjustment, making us involve ourselves with such an issue. Whoever came up with such a thing, there's not much else in psychology like positive maladjustment. And so then we work with it. We try to express it, we try to write it out and so on. That forces us to look at ourselves and to examine ourselves and to find things within our own experience that relate to what he's saying here. And in this way, it grows in us. It comes out of us. It becomes ours. And see, that's what's great about this theory, because when you help somebody else by use of this theory, you are helping them understand their own experience. The two people, it's interesting how Dabrowski talks about is the collaboration between the person who's the kind of helper and the person who needs some help. And by their communication of their experience and the way the two work together, they understand what this difficulty might seem, this kind of neurotic depression, anxiety, compulsion, whatever, how it really fits into a disintegrative process that leads to further development.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to answer the question very briefly that you asked, there are several very good short presentations of the theory. There's one in Wikipedia. Did you write that, Bill? Yeah, so there's one that you could go to right away, the Wikipedia article on the theory of positive disintegration.
Perhaps I can take the opportunity before the questions to say a few words. I think, unlike other people's, especially Tillier's, I hate this. Especially,
Take this microphone.
why would I take my?
Well, because it's a better microphone, take this one. And use it. It's, yeah.
This one?
Yeah, yeah. That's better.
Okay, all right. This will use up about an hour here. Unlike many people, including Tillier's comments about how he first reacted to the theory, I, like many other people in North America, came to the theory through gifted education, and specifically through my interest in counseling gifted individuals. And I was introduced by reading that chapter in Colangelo's and Safran's 1979 book. And I must say, to be honest, that I just about threw that book across the room, because all these strange words, it just sounded really bizarre to me. But I kept bumping into it because it kept being referred to in the literature dealing with the social and emotional aspects of giftedness and counseling. But once I got into it, it's become an area of passion. But having said that, like I said to Susan earlier, sometimes a theory is just a theory. And so we have to bear that in mind. This is a theory. The only issue that perhaps Tillier and I have, and perhaps others, is when statements are attributed to Dabrowski, which he did not make. That's it. Whether you agree, disagree, it's just a theory. The other thing for you people coming at it that are new to it, you find that it's a very challenging, it's kind of like Piaget. Trying to read Piaget in the original. And you mentioned my dear departed friend, Michael Parman, and he and I came up with a phrase, pissed off at Piaget, as we tried to read the original. And the problem with the writing, because I only have access to the English books, is that the use of common psychological terms in an idiosyncratic way. So essentially, he requires the reader to reframe just about every concept you've ever come across. Development. In all the other theories, everybody develops. Not in the theory of positive disintegration. Personality, as Tillier was mentioning. Everybody has a personality according to mainstream psychology. Not in the theory of positive disintegration. So you just have to keep reframing. You have to bear that in mind, that these terms are used in a unique type of way. And the other thing is that from a counseling point of view, if you go to your local shrink and you say you have anxiety for whatever reason, then that psychologist or psychiatrist will try to remove that, to reduce that symptom. Whereas with Dabrowski, he'll wonder, what's the source of that? And if it's because of the inner conflict, then you might say, let's celebrate it. It's not about reducing it. It's about understanding it and working with it. And that's what I had to say.
Sal, the other thing I think you ought to point out is that you have a book. And if you really want a very good synopsis of what's out there in the literature, what thinking is out there in a broader context, that book, I think, is one of the best things that's available to you.
Well, thank you, Frank, and you just reminded me of another point I wanted to make. You know, Tillier was commenting on the critique of research specific and using the OEQ2 and especially the OEQ2 and its use of Likert scales and so on. I just want to put that in perspective, that most of psychological research uses Likert scales. And they have developed, statisticians and methodologists have developed statistical ways of transforming that original data on which one should not use parametric statistics so that it can be used. So it's not that the OEQ is the only scale.
That's an endemic problem with psychology.
But that's psychology, but it's not just the OEQ2. But I do want to reiterate what you were saying about the fact that it's a research instrument, and one should never use any research instrument to draw conclusions or to make recommendations regarding programs, regarding intervention, through the results of giving that questionnaire. This is not a normed test. It's not like the WISP. So you have to bear that in mind. Well, please bear that in mind. Thank you very much.
Joe, let's see if there's two more questions.
One back up there.
Yes, this is for Bill. You had mentioned that educators might not be interested in cognitive disintegration. How might we go about making a change with that? I'm a former Chicago public school teacher, and I'm studying gifted and talented education at the moment, and I do see definite implications for integrating the theory and curriculum in the classroom. And positive disintegration is essentially what we're thinking about teaching students where it's human
If you don't mind,
development.
I'm actually the sort of the K-12 person here, and I'd like to respond to that.
Thank you.
My experience has been over 24 years of teaching at the graduate level, master's degree programs in gifted education, that teachers who are interested in gifted are interested in positive disintegration. I had a course in social emotional development of the gifted, and we used both Sal's book and then my book, with Michael Mahesky, with Intensity. And there were a lot of ahas, recognitions, papers written by them, case studies done of children that they were working with from the view of positive disintegration. I have a lot of questions for my colleagues, because this is not a stage-based theory according to age development. So at what point can we have some young person going through positive disintegration? I'm working.
Dabrowski said as children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm working in a clinical setting now, which I love. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm an educational psychologist with gifted expertise, and I partner with a clinical psychologist, and we're seeing 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds that are disintegrating, and that have positive maladjustment, that say, how can the world be this way? And they're gifted, they're smart enough to think of solutions, and why can't these adults around us figure out how to fix this? It's really stressful for little kids that have that intellect and that also have overexcitabilities and developmental potential and positive maladjustment. So anyhow, my point is, I still teach some graduate coursework, and when the teachers, and sometimes we have counselors doing this as an elective or minor, they're fascinated by this, and they see the explanatory potential of theory for the kids. Does that help?
I think also, I don't know if it'll happen during this conference or at another time maybe online, that there are implications for across disciplines in other fields. How will positive disintegration inform the fields of business, of
Yes,
sports
of course.
psychology, and other fields outside of counseling and
In
education?
Dabrowski 201, I talked about that more. Dabrowski himself listed 9 different applications: history, politics, sociology. There's a lot of implications. One more? Yeah?
Can I ask this question? So, like I said, this theory feels like it could be, it's very powerful. I don't know it well enough. But for, let's say, young, gifted kids, for them to be able to embrace this theory and grow up with it, they could benefit so much more from it. But if you think about a young kid, they may not be able to understand this theory until they're much older. And is there any mechanism or initiative to try to bring that into the young education system?
Okay, so Sal put together a book that's very scholarly and research-based. And Michael Pahevsky and I co-edited and co-authored some parts of with contributions from people here, Living with Intensity. And the 3rd chapter in Living with Intensity is for parents, about how to talk to children about, especially OEs, which that's a point of contention here. But the reason that we emphasize OEs is not because it's the easy part of the theory, it's because it's what parents and teachers and counselors can see in the kids and they can relate to, and we can start saying, this is not a problem, this is potential. And you can teach that to very young children.
This lady from Chicago also says that's all they've been exposed to too. If they're exposed to the rest of it, they'll get turned on to the rest of it too. Because it has a strong explanatory component.
Yes, and there are a couple of books I'm spacing on them right now, but I don't mean to plug Great Potential Press, but there's a book on being intense and et cetera, that's largely grounded in Dabrowski, and it's for teens. And,
Well, another thing I'll point out is
it's Lisa Rivera.
Stephanie Tolan's stuff on cheetah.
Yeah,
That might be a thing.
yeah.
One more and we're
You're
done.
welcome.
Well, go ahead, about 2 more. Go ahead.
I guess I just have a comment towards the questions here. As
Go
a
ahead.
teacher of students that have been gifted and intense and really disenfranchised by our education system, I see a need for helping our teachers to understand this theory. And that's, I think, what maybe they were trying to get at, is that, yes, we can understand it, and I don't know so much that we want to teach a 7-year-old about TPD or anything like that. Yeah, but what I'm saying is, as teachers, those of us who have taken on this field, those of us who work with these kids, understand a lot of this, and we get the aha.
You know something funny? I didn't say this, but I think I'll add this now. When I was in grade 5, the teacher said that I was retarded.
Exactly.
When I was in grade 7, the teacher said to my mother, "We're sorry that the school can't provide the program that Bill needs." My mother said to the teacher, "Well, yes, we understand that Bill's slow." And she said, "Oh, no, he's gifted." So there's 2 teachers in 2 years that are, they just don't understand what they're seeing.
And I guess for me, we need to do no harm. Okay, because that's, I think, so much, I coach these kids, that's what I sort of taken on this market. And what I'm seeing is, I have to help them reframe what's said to them.
Reframe.
That's what chapter 3 in Living with Intensity is.
Yes.
It's like, you emphasize the positive first. Oh, you have so much energy, you can do all this, but you are very energetic, and let's think of some ways that we can relax. So let's draw our vocabulary.
There's a lot more out there than what Bill is talking about. This is, I agree, 101. That literature is extensive. So it's important to understand the theory. It's also important to understand that Dabrowski was very much in favor of empirical testing of that theory. So there's a lot of that going on. And some of it will agree with what Bill has presented, and some of it will disagree. But that's part of the intellectual dialogue. And it's a much broader field of individuals involved. The people that are presenting here at this session are numerous, and they're not uninformed with regard to the theory or with regard to the research that's there. So I'd encourage you to keep an open mind and not think that things are sort of like dead. It's very much alive, and a lot of stuff going on.
Let me give you a historical anecdote as well, so that it's important. And I think that there's a role here for many different things, okay? But Dabrowski himself was a theoretician, and he really didn't care about research. He had a perfect marriage with Wachowski, because Wachowski was a microbiologist. And in 1968, the Canada Research Council had a series of grants that provided money, and they got enough money to fund their whole team. But one of the criteria of the grant was that there had to be empirical measurements there. Dabrowski applied for the grants and said to Michael, "Can you do this?" And he said yes. And so they were able to come up with a grant application to measure the theory using what at that time was verbal stimuli. And that got them the money that kept them going from 68 to 69 to 70. There were 3 years of grants they got. And that was where the empirical component came in. And Michael told me at one point that he felt that if he could quantify it, he would prove. That for him it was a question of, he would prove the validity of it if he could quantify it. Now, again, my experience of Dabrowski was, it's the idea that's the most important thing, and he would say to you, well, others will eventually find out if I'm right or wrong. And he would encourage research, but like he wasn't into it, but he would encourage research and say, this is great, research that, research from beginning to end. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, last comment.
First of all, I want to say that he did engage in research. What he didn't engage in is the kind of group, well, he did some group research too, but he has numerous case studies,
Right.
which is empirical research.
Well, yes, case studies,
It's qualitative
Correct.
as opposed to survey research.
Correct.
But nevertheless, he did infer from these case studies the whole theory. It isn't just on the theoretical level, derived from other theories.
And from his patients, and
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
yeah, and that's an important thing, is that he had a very active I wouldn't say psychoanalytic, but he had a very active practice. He was a psychiatrist. He saw mental patients as part of his practice once a week in Edmonton. And that was important.
Yeah, and he also did studies of famous creative persons.
Right,
Well, all the way from Beethoven
right,
to
biographical analysis.
Michelangelo and so on.
Okay, I think we're going to close this off. I'm not sure this was my role, but it looks like I'm the only one standing up here. Just a couple of things. Number one, as I'm standing here and listening, especially to the questions, I think that's what this whole Congress is about. It's going to inform you, it's going to challenge you, you're going to challenge back. I think that's part of the excitement and the learning that will come out of the next day and a half of presentations. As well as later this evening, we have our first keynote from Dr. Laurie Nixon, who's in the audience today. So first of all, we do want to thank our 4 presenters, or co-presenters. Certainly in the background, we have Dr. Susan Daniels, we have Dr. Dexter Amon, and I'm not sure, is that the way you pronounce it? Amen. Okay, amen. Now we got it. Don't forget. And I was going to say amen, amen. And then Dr. Sal Mendagio, all of whom are presenting at another point in the Congress. So you're you're going to have some great choices, there's no question about that. And certainly to Bill, for doing the major component of this, in fact, and you do in your conference package have a list of references. One of those links is to his website, and you'll see a lot of the archival information that's there too. And something that we hope to continue to add to after this Congress is to continue to build on the proceedings and making those available.
So, Joe, one more thing that's important, I forgot. I kind of made a deal with these guys. If you came to 101 and you email me, I will send you a link to download all of Dabrowski for free.
Great, and thanks for that generosity, because normally Bill would charge for that, which is how he keeps his archival system going and so on. So thank you for that. So I have the honor of presenting 4 thank you cards, basically, and I just want to recognize, as you've probably seen this kind of logo that was adopted for the Congress in several places on the website, on the brochures, on your name tags, and that kind of thing. And to one of our co-chairs of the Congress, Dr. Christina Laycraft, is the one who created that, very artistic, creative person as well. So we're going to have those available for all of the sessions and to be given to all of the presenters. So thank you, but before you go, and before I hand these out, it's about 4:15 now, and so between now and 6:30, you're basically on your own. This is the only meal, if you like, that is not provided in your registration, starting tomorrow morning with breakfast and then lunch and then the banquet. And there is a reception here, though, at 6:30. And so it'll just be out in the foyer there and spill over into this area. And the reason we're doing that is because there's actually a wedding going on in a ballroom right next door. We're going to take over all of that.
Let's go to the wedding.
We may end up with a few people who think they're at a wedding coming in here tonight, but they have a few people at the Dabrowski Congress going to. So don't get confused. Now, one of the things we're going to point out is that the Congress, because of the number of sessions we're running simultaneously, we're going to keep things as tight as we can. And I know Yannicka is going to meet with the committee and the presenters right after Dr. Roy Nixon's session tonight. We'll talk a little bit about the detail in keeping as tight as we can, and yet at the same time building in some additional network time, because the 10 or 15-minute breaks doesn't give you a lot of that opportunity. So I don't have to keep saying things spontaneously because I have to be standing there. Christina Laycraft, we've already identified, so stand up, Christina, as one of the co-chairs. I know fairly well, Dr. Yannicka Frank is the other co-chair. Thank you for coming. I hope it was stimulating. I hope it was challenging. I hope it gave you a little anxiety. Enjoy the evening. We'll see you 6:30, 7:30 for the official opening.
It's like getting off the plane. It is. Everybody else